Okay, enough of that jibber jabber. Let's get the show on the road. To start off, Professor Angela Davis is known internationally for her ongoing work to combat all forms of oppression in the United States and abroad. Over the years, she has been active as a student, teacher, writer, scholar, and activist organizer. She is a living witness to the historical struggles of the contemporary era.
Professor Davis' political activism began when she was a youngster in Birmingham, Alabama, and continued through her high school years in New York. But it was not until 1969 that she came to national attention after being removed from her teaching position in the philosophy department at UCLA as a result of her social activism and her membership in the Communist Party, USA.
Today she remains an advocate for prison abolition and has developed a powerful critique of racism in the criminal justice system. She is a member of the advisory board of the Prison Activist Resource Center and currently working on a comparative study of women's imprisonment in the U.S., the Netherlands, and Cuba.
During the last 25 years, Professor Davis has lectured in all of the 50 United States, as well as in Africa, Europe, the Caribbean, and the former Soviet Union. Her articles and essays have appeared in numerous journals and anthologies, and she is the author of 5 books, including Angela Davis, an autobiography, Women, Race, and Class, Blues Legacies and Black Feminism, Gertrude Ma Rainey, Bessie Smith and Billie Holiday, and the Angela Davis Reader.
Former California Governor Ronald Reagan once vowed that Angela Davis would never again teach in the University of California system. Today, she is a tenured professor in the History of Consciousness Department at the University of California, Santa Cruz. In 1994, she received the distinguished honor of an appointment to the University of California Presidential Chair in African American and Feminist Studies. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to Professor Angela Davis.
Thank you. Is this working? Hello, hello. Sound person. What did you tell me your name was? Rebecca. Okay, thank you, Rebecca. It's working fine now. First of all, it's really good to see so many of you out on a beautiful Saturday afternoon in Eugene, Oregon. Thank you. I'd like to say thanks to all of the sponsoring organizations and especially the Multicultural Center and the Black Student Union and the list. Where's that list? Oh, may I see the poster? Oh, I haven't seen this poster yet. Okay. Oh, and a very interesting poster. Ivan made it. Where's Ivan? Thank you, Ivan. Okay, perhaps I can take one with me when I leave? Okay. This is the first time I have been here at the University of Oregon, I think, since 1994 or so. That is 13 years. And I was just thinking before someone told me it was 1994 that, oh, I was in Eugene very recently. You know, I mean, this is what happens when you get older. Isn't that right? You know? But let's talk a little bit about these times. And I've been asked to speak about ways of organizing, mobilizing, not so much the specifics and the logistics, but some general ideas perhaps about prospects today. And I think this is actually a good time. This is a good time to assemble and talk about what we might do to strengthen our movements? And I assume that most people who would take the time to come out on a Saturday afternoon here in Eugene care deeply about the future of this community, the future of the country, the future of the world. Am I right? And I also assume that you wonder what is happening in Washington. You know, how is it possible that a person who was, first of all, not really elected to the presidency can disregard what has become the majority view of the people of this country? I don't know whether you saw the interview on 60 Minutes, what was that, last Sunday, in which President Bush tried to explain why he is not willing to listen to our voices. We are all saying in the war in Iraq, in the war. And he says, well, I can't do that. And when asked why, he says, well, sometimes I feel like I'm the commander-in-chief at the same time as I am, check this out, the educator-in-chief. I mean, that's really ironic, you know, particularly since he let us know early on, I think early in the first term, that he really did not enjoy his years as an undergraduate. He didn't really appreciate the education he was supposed to be getting. So he says that actually what is happening in Iraq is what he called a, quote, classic ideological struggle. This after having once again evoked the notion of democracy, which has become, it seems to me, so meaningless to so many people around the world, that they have learned how to interpret that word, democracy, coming out of the mouth of President Bush, George Bush. I actually don't even like saying President Bush. It sounds like an oxymoron, but they've learned how to recognize that what he is really talking about is capitalism. And it seems to me that this is a time to figure out how we can develop the kind of vocabulary that will help us to do some kind of education, not the kind that he was talking about, but to urge people to be critical and to try to understand that the democracy that has been evoked and conjured up time and time again, that has allegedly been exported to the Middle East, is not the democracy that brings hope of justice and equality and an end to racism and an end to homophobia, an end to the assaults on immigrant rights. And so we have to begin to propose our versions of democracy. And perhaps this is a good time to do this. The election that happened 2 months ago sent a very clear message to all of the pro-war elected officials, including to Bush and Cheney, that we and people around the world are saying that enough is enough. Stop using the war on terror as a pretext to erode and destroy the promise of democracy, both in Iraq and here at home. Also, stop the assault on immigrants. Stop the assault on immigrants. We want human rights for all people, all workers, especially workers from racially oppressed communities, and especially from immigrant communities, both documented and undocumented. Now, let's not forget that not very long ago, Donald Rumsfeld was forced to resign. I mean, that's a major victory, and we have to claim it as a victory. But I remember some years ago when, Rumsfeld is from Germany originally. And there's a town in Germany where many of his long-lost relatives live, and they embraced him when he became Secretary of Defense. But immediately after the invasion of Iraq, this entire town disowned him, publicly disowned him. Now, I want to sort of broaden our perspective. I'm talking about the ways in which we have in recent times achieved some small victories, some minor victories, which may serve as a foundation for moving forward and building movements. I was quite impressed when Hugo Chavez commented on the November elections. And what he said was, the Bush administration has fallen democratically. The fall has begun. And then also he suggested that perhaps George Bush should follow Donald Rumsfeld, that actually might be a democratic gesture. And then, of course, shortly after that, Chavez won overwhelmingly in Venezuela, and that is a victory we should claim. And since we're talking about elections, shortly after that, Daniel Ortega won the elections in Nicaragua. And I was going to speak about Morales in Bolivia as well. Sometimes I really don't like to refer to myself as an American. For more reasons than one. And one of them is that the U.S. has monopolized, colonized the use of that term. We live in the Americas. It's an entire hemisphere. And why is it that people in the U.S. have assumed the right of referring to themselves as Americans to the exclusion of so many other people? But I'm quite happy to refer to myself as an American when I consider myself a hemispheric citizen, right? Of the Americas. And so I can look toward Hugo Chavez for leadership here. And I can look toward Nicaragua and look toward Bolivia. And as we reflect on this issue of community mobilization, I think that's the topic I was asked to reflect on today. We should think about our communities as being far vaster than the communities in our universities or in our cities or towns or in our regions or in our country. That's a major challenge, particularly for people in this country, to think of ourselves as part of a much larger community, because somehow we've learned that the U.S. is the most powerful country in the world. And even those of us who are opposed to the prevailing politics, who are opposed to the prevailing socials and economic systems, who might want to see, for example, a socialist United States of America, some of us still have not learned how to have not learned to express a measure of humility in relation to the rest of the world. Somehow we still imagine ourselves as supreme. And this is a major challenge, because we have a great deal to learn from our sisters and brothers and comrades and friends all over the world. And when I talk about this issue, I remember what happened 5.5 years ago in the aftermath of September 11th, 2001. And I remember how easy it was to mobilize the nationalist feelings of people in this country, including really progressive people. Why is it that in Congress, let's not forget that, there was only one person who voted against the resolution that gave to the president the right to use force? What was it called? The use of force resolution? Yes, exactly. And this is what led to the invasion in Iraq. The only person was Barbara Lee. And she is my representative. I am honored to say I live in Oakland, California. I guess Oakland must be in the house as well this afternoon, so. But let's not forget that. Let's not forget that there were so many progressive, so-called progressive Congress people who said, well, they were really opposed to it, but they didn't want it to seem like they were soft on terrorism. How could that happen? And then there was this emergence of what we might call the new multicultural nation. And so many of us who had felt previously excluded from that multicultural embrace were invited to become a part of the new diverse nation, right? You remember later on when Bush went to Brazil, and the first time he'd gone to Brazil, he expressed surprise that there were so many black people in Brazil. I mean, he did. And Condoleezza Rice had to, take him aside. Talk about the slave trade and, all of that. I guess he said, oh. So the next time he went to Brazil, the very next time he went to Brazil, he was giving a press conference with Lula, and he said something like, I'm happy to be in this multicultural nation, which is similar to our multicultural nation. Well, the point I'm making is that some of us who've been historically excluded felt relieved that finally we had been accepted. Finally we had been asked to sit down at the table. Finally we were Americans. Not taking into consideration the fact that we were asked to be Americans because this was all about mobilization for war. This was all about mobilization against an enemy. A friend of mine who actually has a dual passport. She's from Ghana and she's lived in the UK, and she teaches here and I think has citizenship in the U.S. now. She said she was coming back, I think from London, not too long after 9/11. And she said for the very first time, and she's done that journey I don't know how many times, and for the very first time she was greeted by immigration officials who had smiles on their faces and who said, "Welcome home." Now, this mobilization, actually it was an emotional mobilization. It was a mobilization of the collective emotions of some people in this country. It assumed the exclusion of others. And so this was the period during which, and this continues to happen, of course, aggressive, racist assaults on people who were assumed to be Arab or assumed to be Muslim, and oftentimes there's no distinction between Arab and Muslim, right? Assumed to be from the Middle East, including many South Asians, including many Latinos who looked like they might be Arab, which meant they might be Muslim, which meant they might be terrorists, right? I mean, think about how this process happened. And the passage of the Patriot Act. The passage of the Patriot Act with no discussion whatever. This is a fascist document. This is a fascist document. And we are living with the consequences of that legislation. And of course, we have the most diverse government in the history of this country, right? Talking about we'll talk a little bit about diversity, yeah. But I just want to point out that we have a very diverse government. We have a black woman who's Secretary of State. We have a Latino who's Attorney General. And Gonzalez is enjoying working with the Patriot Act, as you've noticed from recent developments. Now, the most recent elections indicate, I think, that we are beginning to think a bit more critically about the situation we all helped to construct. And, as someone who's been active in radical political struggles virtually all of my life, I have come to the understanding that it's really important to be self-reflective. Self-reflective, not so much individually self-reflective, although that's important as well. But we need to think about the collective selves that we have created, and we need to reflect on our own involvement in these vast developments. Oftentimes we talk as if, all of this stuff has nothing to do with anything we've ever done. The emergence of Guantanamo, the creation of these secret prisons all over Europe, and of course the horrible tortures about which we learned in places like Abu Ghraib. We talk as if this is something we have nothing to do with. But I think we are implicated in this. And it's important for us to collectively reflect on what we might have done to prevent the emergence of these horrifying developments. And therefore what we might do in order to maximize our hopes for a better future. Now, I've been working around prison issues for a very long time. The majority of my life. I went to jail because I was doing work around prison issues. I had no idea that was going to happen. But I was working around the campaign for the freedom of a whole number of political prisoners in the Black Panther Party, for example, the Soledad brothers, for example. And I had been previously involved. I think the first political prisoner campaign I became involved in was that of Nelson Mandela, when I was quite young, and Lolita Lebron and the Puerto Rican nationalists. And actually, if I think back, I can remember when the Rosenbergs were executed, and what a horrible blow that was. And I can remember my parents and their friends talking about Sacco and Vanzetti in the 20s. And my mother was involved in the campaign to free the Scottsboro Nine in Alabama, right? So I guess I kind of had no choice about that. I mean, it was I grew up with a consciousness of the use of this institution called the prison as a weapon against democracy, as a weapon against the hopes of people for a better life, as a weapon particularly against those who were calling for a radical revolutionary change, who were calling for the overthrow of the capitalist system in this country. And I could spend the rest of my time giving you examples of people who went to prison for their beliefs. And then I could talk about myself going to jail and finding myself on the FBI's 10 most wanted list, which was really quite bizarre. And this is one of the reasons today, and I'll perhaps at the end of my comments, I'd like to talk a little bit about Assata Shakur. Because I can remember when I was when I was underground, I guess. And Richard Nixon was president then. And he publicly called me on several occasions a terrorist. So I'm really interested in that category, and how it is deployed. As a matter of fact, Nixon wrote a letter to my brother, who at that time was a professional football player with the Cleveland Browns, telling him how much of a fan he was and how sorry he was that basically that he had a sister who was a terrorist. and that was really supposed to make my brother realize that he needed to help the FBI find me. And when he didn't, and when instead he helped to organize, he and his wife organized the largest political rally in Cleveland since the 1930s, then very mysteriously my brother got put on the bench. You know, even though he was at the height of his career and was winning all kinds of records and all of that. But he wasn't frightened by that word terrorist. He wasn't. Many of us today are. It reminds me very much of the way people learn how to react to the word communist. And some of you are old enough to remember that this term had the power to persuade people to turn against members of their family, to turn against their friends and their colleagues. You know, one of the problems in this country is that we don't have historical memory. And so younger generations don't know about this. I mean, they may have heard about the McCarthy era, and they may have, you know, they may have heard the name J. Edgar Hoover, but maybe they haven't. I don't know. But we do not, well, first of all, the educational institutions don't do the work they really should do. And many of us are now sort of self-satisfied since we have managed to acquire some new department, some new programs. We have women's studies programs, feminist studies, ethnic studies. But the thing is that those formations can work methodologically in exactly the same way as all of the conventional departments, and they end up reproducing the same ideas. Now, it means that we have to be attentive to other forms of education as well. And I'm not suggesting that there aren't really amazing new formations within the university. And I was really happy to learn that Michael Hames Garcia is the director of the new ethnic studies program here. But then I was surprised to learn that they don't have any independent appointments. They can't make decisions around the people they want to hire and give tenure to. And there's something kind of strange about that, isn't it? I'm not trying to get you in trouble, Michael. This is just my response. So the point is that while we have to continue our struggles within these institutions, within what the philosopher Louis Althusser called this particular ideological state apparatus, while we have to continue those struggles, we also have to develop modes of popular education. Because popular discourse is particularly important if we want to build the kinds of sustained, ongoing communities of struggle. So it means that we need to be attentive to our ideas, we need to be attentive to the vocabularies we use, we need to be critical about the extent to which sometimes, even in the process of trying to challenge what we consider to be oppressive structures and institutions and ideas, we use the same language, we use the same vocabularies, and we end up doing the work of the institution we think we're fighting against. And, you know, I think about our ongoing struggle to defend affirmative action and the way in which we sometimes at least implicitly assent to the idea that affirmative action is reverse discrimination. It's just that we need reverse discrimination. And that people, particularly young people who should be the beneficiaries of affirmative action, feel as if they're tainted, feel as if there is something wrong, feel as if to receive a scholarship or to be admitted on affirmative action terms somehow means that they do not really deserve it. They do not really merit it. And we don't have the arguments, the vocabularies, the arguments to counter that. But we keep saying we want affirmative action. Now, one of the points I try to make, and I'll just have to do this very quickly. Wow. I asked Steve to be my timekeeper to let me know. Just very, very simply, affirmative action was proposed as a strategy to assist communities to overcome institutional barriers. It was a collective strategy, not an individual strategy. It wasn't designed to help individuals. But of course it has to help individuals in the process. But that's not the point. That's not the point. Because there are individuals. Ward Connolly, for example, was a beneficiary of an affirmative action program in California. And this is the man who is responsible for the passage of Proposition 209 and the dismantling of affirmative action programs in California, and also in Washington, and also most recently in Michigan. So here you have this black man who was running around the country trying to persuade everybody that affirmative action is reverse discrimination. And he always fails to mention that his company, his construction company, I believe it was the beneficiary of an affirmative action program, and that's how he made his name. That's how he ended up getting appointed to the Board of Regents. But that, neither here nor there. But people like Condoleezza Rice, let me see if I can give you an example of the difference between the individual and the community-oriented or collective strategy. And I've been saying recently, been talking about this since it sort of occurred to me one day that people were always asking me about Condoleezza Rice. And did you know her? Well, actually, we grew up in the same city. And my sister actually, I won't talk about my sister. But what became apparent to me was that we narrated our lives in very much the same way, at least the early part of our lives. We talked about the same city and the same barriers and the same emotions that were conjured by the myriad forms of exclusion characteristic of what was at that time the most segregated city in the South. And so, we both talked about what it felt like having to go to a segregated school, or what it felt like not being able to go to the main library, but rather only to the very, very tiny black branches, the Negro library branches, or what it was like to see, all of these, the museums and symphonies and amusement parks and all of these things in the city where we live, knowing that black people were absolutely barred. And then we also talked about, interestingly enough, a pivotal moment in our lives being the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church and the killing of 4 young black girls, because we both had connections to those girls. Condoleezza knew one of them quite well. One of the girls, Cynthia Wesley, lived 2 doors away from us. I was a little bit older than they were, but I babysat for her. And another one was the younger sister of one of my best friends, and one of my younger sisters really good. So there were all these connections. And so the trauma was really a personal trauma as well as the political trauma. And so it's just really interesting that we can tell our stories in the same way. And I said, something's wrong here. I have to figure out a way to disassociate. And then I realized, actually, there was, it wasn't all the same, because things started to change. I guess I didn't get recruited by the CIA or, during the period of the Cold War, I wasn't, I didn't learn Russian so that I could, well, anyway. But that's not really the point. The point I want to make is that in the telling of her own story, she always ends with triumph. Right? Look at this black girl from Birmingham, Alabama, who was able to overcome all of these obstacles and all of these barriers in order to make it to the top. And that's the American trajectory, right? The lone individual who triumphs despite all odds. And if you look at the way many of the stories of our of the people whose legacies we respect, if you look at the way many of their stories are represented, they're also represented as individual stories. We're celebrating Martin Luther King Week. And Dr. King's legacy, publicly presented as the legacy of an individual, has, as a matter of fact, allowed all of the other people and all of the other things and all of the other ideas that enabled his emergence as a spokesperson for that movement to drop out of history, to fall between the cracks of history. And so you're only left with this heroic man, right? So back to Condoleezza Rice. She's the hero. She's the heroic individual. And she claims triumph. And what differentiates me from her, I believe, is the fact that even though I obviously am doing a lot better than I was in 1960, 70 when I was in jail. You know, and that was indeed a kind of triumph then, but it wasn't an individual triumph. You know, I didn't get out of jail and avoid a capital punishment or avoid a life sentence because of anything that I did individually. It was all because of the work of huge numbers of people, you know, all over this country, including, you know, right here in Eugene. That's the only reason I was able to become the beneficiary of that triumph. And today, as I said, even though I'm doing much better, it's really hard for me to even think about this as a victory. Because, you know, I look at the fact that there are 2.2 million people behind bars. You know, I look at the fact that there are more poor people in this country than ever before. You know, I look at the rise of the, you know, of neo-conservative ideology, and particularly the anti-immigrant sentiments and the horrendous homophobia, and there's no way I can claim triumph. And so getting back to the work that I was trying to do around affirmative action. Affirmative action as a strategy was designed to produce structural change, institutional change, change for entire communities. It was not about individuals. And so when an individual white man claims that he's the target of reverse discrimination, where is that collective, that community of white men which has experienced historical discrimination and violence and bias? There isn't. But we don't know how to talk about that. We get stuck. You know, when that woman in Michigan, what was her name? The one who worked with Ward Connolly. Don't you remember her name? Oh, I have it somewhere. But anyway, when she didn't get accepted at the University of Michigan, you know what I'm talking about. What's her name? You don't remember either? Okay. Okay. Well, anyway, I didn't want to say the white woman in Michigan, but I wanted to say her name. But when she interpreted the fact that she did not get admitted to the university, and as a matter of fact, there were people of color who were admitted who had lower grades than she did, she called reverse discrimination. So what is that supposed to mean? I mean, a grade's supposed to be somehow the value of the individual? Do grades stand in relation to the aspiring student in the same way that price stands in relation to the commodities that we buy? I mean, I think maybe that's the assumption there. But Greg, you didn't tell me what time it was. Okay, I have too many notes. Okay, let me see if I can jump to the end, because I actually have too many notes here. Scrolling down. Wait, let me see if there's anything really important that I wanted to... Yeah, I mean, the theme that I think I'm trying to develop has to do with the extent to which we are all implicated in these developments from which we like to distance ourselves. We like to think about them as having been produced by someone else. You know, whether we're talking about the government, the president, whether we're talking about the corporations, whether we're talking about the administration. And I think it's extremely important for us to reflect on what we can do, not so much as individuals, but as communities. And in fact, how can we build community? How can we build a sense of community in struggle? And something like the discourse on affirmative action has to be turned around if we are to begin to think of ourselves as connected to one another. Because the very way in which affirmative action has been represented militates against the whole ideas that we inhabit communities. It represents us all as isolated individuals, pitted one against the other. And this is one of the reasons something like this enormous prison industrial complex has emerged. Because we don't think about how it is that all of these people who have been herded into these massive edifices of torture, which is what they are there not so much because of what they did as individuals, which isn't to say that a lot of them haven't done pretty bad things, but there are a whole lot of people who have done worse things, and they're not there. They're not there. But they're behind bars because race matters when it comes to determining who's going to get to go to prison and who's going to get to go to the university. They're there because this institution of the prison has increasingly become a garbage disposal. It has become a place for people who cannot find their place in society because the jobs that they might have had have dissipated. Deindustrialization, globalization of capital. They're there because the education they might have had has become the hope only of people who can afford to attend such institutions. They're there because the whole school system, the whole public school system in this country is a shamble. Kids do not learn. Kids are not educated there. They do not learn. You know, some of them may learn how to read. Some of them may learn math. Some of them may learn a little history. But they do not learn how to value knowledge. That is the message that is missing. And many of them, particularly in black communities and Latino communities and poor communities, they learn that going to school is being disciplined. You know, it's being, in some places it's being guarded. It's going to a place where the halls are paroled by armed guards. Or going to a place where in order to get into the school you have to go through a metal detector. Yeah, they learn, it's prep school for prison. prep school for the juvenile facilities, and then the juvenile facilities then create the populations for the prisons. And this is happening not only in this country, but it's happening all over the world. See, this is a peculiarly American function of the prison. And if I were actually giving a lecture on the history of the prison, I could talk about the pivotal role that this institution has played in the particular development of democracy here. So that it is actually the quintessential democratic institution, and I'm using scare quotes because I'm referring to a particular kind of democracy. I'm referring to a class democracy, a racialized democracy. And now, not only all over Europe do you have this function of the prison emerging as immigrants in the post-colonial era moved to places like France and Germany and the Netherlands, from continents like Africa and Asia. But in the global South, you have the use of this institution in order to serve as a dumping ground of for those people who no longer fit into the new social organization, particularly occasioned by the emergence of privatization and the World Bank and the IMF and the structural adjustment. So in structural adjustment, what happens is that capital is moved from areas of the economy that are unprofitable, that is to say schools and subsidies for housing, health care, all of those things that help human beings. Capital is moved from those areas of the economy to profitable areas of the economy. That is to say, some new, some old transnational corporations that are moving. You know, I could actually talk about, what's the name of that company in Oregon? Yeah, that one. But if you look at the extent to which this institution, the prison, is being marketed on a global scale, and you go into a community in a country in the global South that is impoverished, that is utterly impoverished, where people don't have decent housing or health care or any of those services that they might need to exist. And what will you find there? You'll find a spanking new prison with the most advanced technology. And you have to begin to think about that this is the introduction of all this technology that we take for granted to people in many areas of Africa, Latin America. This is how they become, this is their first encounter with this technology, the technology that is used to guarantee that people are separated from each other in prison. Now, of course, the panoptic prisons are now run by monitors, right? So everything is surveillance, and cells are locked simultaneously. And, well, anyway, this is their introduction to technology, and this is happening all over the world. All over the world. So it should not have been a surprise that in relation to the Iraq War, the prison acquires place on the central stage, And so we learn about Guantanamo, we learn about Abu Ghraib, we learn about the extent to which the U.S. has become the prison guard of the world. And the point I want to make before I conclude here is that had we developed early on massive campaigns to prevent the development of this prison industrial complex here, when there were 200,000 people in prison, if we said, we have too many people in prison in this country, there should not be 200,000 people in prison. And some of us were actually saying that in the 70s. We're saying there are 200,000 people. 200,000 people in prison. That sounded like it was not imaginable. And then, of course, now we have far more than 2 million people. This country incarcerates more people per capita than any other country in the world. We could have done something about this. We could have said no, just as we could have said no in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. And we knew that the whole thing in Iraq was a setup. We knew that. We knew Al-Qaeda wasn't in Iraq, right? A lot of us did. Alternative media, right? We knew that. And we could have gone out in the streets and we could have said, no, absolutely not. We could have organized our friends and our co-workers. And the point is that there's a lot that we can do right now at this very moment. And this is a pivotal moment. And not everybody has to do the same thing. But maybe what we can do today is to reflect on what it is we can do individually. And it's always important to decide to do something that you love, not something that you think is just an obligation, because nobody wants anybody who wishes they were out, I don't know, in Santa Cruz I would say out surfing. But what can I say in Eugene? Gardening, climbing a mountain. Right. So, the important thing is to find something about which you can be passionate, that you can really love, that you can really embrace, that you can make a part of your very lives. And if you love gardening, you need to have time to do gardening. You have to do that. You have to garden. That's right. You can bring a garden to prison. And that's been done. I learned how to do organic gardening when I worked with a program in the San Francisco County Jail run by a woman named Kathy Sneed, who developed a whole organic garden and a whole organic gardening program for people who were in jail. So they learned how to do organic gardening. And then when they got out, she created more gardens so they could do that work. So yeah, that's a great idea. Okay. And so, let me just say that we can make a difference. We can make a difference. We must make a difference. Thank you very much.
Hello. Mike, perhaps. Hello, 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 hello.
Oh, okay. Let's talk about this afterwards, okay?
Hello. What is her name again? Laura? Okay. Oh, okay. This one isn't on. Maybe just announce time for question and answer.
Are there, this is,
I just wanted to know what were your sentiments on how the president dealt with the situation in New Orleans with Katrina.
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. That was, oh, you couldn't hear the question? Oh, okay. It has to do with New Orleans and my analysis of the way Bush handled the situation in the aftermath of Katrina. And I thanked him for asking that question because I actually did have a number of things in my notes about New Orleans. I think it's really important for us not to allow the media's sense of time, the mass media's representation of time, to destroy our inability to create historical time and to remember. Because oftentimes, as soon as something leaves the front page, we forget. We forget. And I don't know, why is that? Why do you think we've acquired this ability, first of all, to react in an intensely emotional way? And many of you can remember being glued in front of the television and watching those images and how you felt when you saw people stranded on roofs, and when you realized that the government, where are they? Where is somebody? Bush flew over, I guess. I think Bush was playing golf oh, he was fishing. Oh, he was doing something like that. Yeah. And then they told him, and he just said, okay. That was 9/11. You see what I mean about how our sense of history gets. But the point I wanted to make is that I was actually just in New Orleans in about exactly a month ago. I went there in connection with a campaign for amnesty for people who were imprisoned during Katrina. And that's really an important campaign because it allows us to think about how racism can so easily be deployed. What was it, Kanye West talked about the fact that if it was a black person who was stealing something, it was a looter, and if it was a white person, it was a forager, or something like that. And that was true. Survivors and refugees and all. Yeah, you're right. All of those terms. Now, when I went there, I learned about the case of a woman, a 73-year-old black woman, who was evacuating with her 81-year-old disabled husband from New Orleans. And they went to this town called Kenner. We're right on the outskirts of New Orleans. And she was actually moving things from her car into the motel room. She was in the motel parking lot. And this cop saw her taking food in and arrested her. She was 73 years old. And what he said was, oh, a deli was looted. Now, this happened during those days, end of August, I can't remember exactly when. She stayed in jail. Not only jail, but she was sent to the women's prison. She stayed in the women's prison until the next January. And when she was released the next January, she was released on $50,000 bail. And that was only because a campaign developed. That was only because there was some national publicity. Eventually the charges were dropped. Had there not been a specific campaign around her, she would probably still be in prison today. And there are many other examples. I mean, that's probably the most dramatic one, but there are many examples, especially of younger people, especially of, black youth who. So I just wanted to remind us that this happens, and it's still happening. And as a matter of fact, I felt really devastated when I went to New Orleans, to tell the truth. And, all of the things that I had been to the outskirts of, I had been to Louisiana immediately afterwards, but this was the first time I actually did a tour of the lower Ninth Ward. And, I mean, you wouldn't believe it. It's really hard to describe. Block after block after block after block after block after block. Destruction, devastation. It's still like a war zone. A few houses are inhabited. There's like common ground. They have a house there, right? Yeah. But you don't see people there. It's totally destroyed, and nobody is helping. Now, if you go to some of the other areas of New Orleans where people suffered really serious destruction as well, I mean, you can see the changes happening. You can see the construction. Some people have trailers, and they're living in the front yard, and they're working, in the trailer, and they're building their houses. But in the lower Ninth Ward, which is where mostly people who rent it live, there's nothing. And many of the people who live there are in Houston and Atlanta, and they want to go home. But there's no way for them to go home because nobody is creating the kind of environment that would be welcoming. And as a matter of fact, there are a lot of people who do not want so many poor people in New Orleans anymore. They don't want to create the housing, and they don't want to create the schools. And then what's really terrible is that there is a lot of violence in New Orleans right now. And people use that as an excuse for not doing anything that would help people who look a certain way, who come from a certain class context. And so, thank you for asking that question. I'm not going to answer your question about Bush because I'm just, I mean, I always say whenever I travel and people ask me, how is George Bush possible? I mean, it's surreal. It's really surreal. It's worse than anything you could ever see on Saturday Night Live. Oh, I guess I should shut up now.
Is this working? Many of us are aware that there's all kinds of laws set up that martial law could happen in a moment if there's an economic collapse or we attack Iran or there's a false or real terrorist attack or whatnot. Many of us are also aware, and I wanted to know your comment on this, that there is apparently many internment camps that have been set up and that are currently being set up and paid for by a subsidiary of Halliburton all over the country. And there could be maybe a roundup of thinking people and so forth, at worst case scenario. Talk about surreal. Do you have any comments? Thank you.
Well, I think you're right to pinpoint a company like Halliburton, but Halliburton's not alone.
Brown and Root has a $365 million contract to build more of them.
Yeah. And I don't have any more information than you do. I have read the accounts. It does not surprise me. And we probably should not think of it as so far-fetched, particularly given the experience in the aftermath of 9/11, when people were picked up off the street, they were picked up on their jobs, and oftentimes it was only because of the way they looked, right? And we know that people have spent years in Guantanamo. They've spent years in prisons in places like Egypt and all over the world because the U.S. Had some evidence that they looked like they might be terrorists. Right? I mean, it's like the young man from Brazil who was shot down in London, right? And I think that if we don't resist, if we don't fight back, we will be encountering more of these sort of fascist-like mobilizations in this country. So thank you.
Ms. Davis? When I went out to the book table from the bookstore and I asked if they had your autobiography, and I had looked for it before, I've had 6 or 7 copies, and I've given every damn one away as a gift. And when the woman said, she said, well, they're out of print. And I said, well, I don't have any copy. I gave them all away. She said, that sucks. so I hope it's not, that's what they said. Okay. I've looked for it in many places and have not been able to. Thank you. I share your
let me just tell you, it's not out of print.
Okay.
It's, the publisher is International Publishers. And, maybe because it's a left-wing publishing company, it doesn't appear.
Okay.
Right. But they have lots of copies.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. Ms. Davis, I share your excitement, your enthusiasm of the recent victories in our Americas, in particular the victory of Hugo Chavez, the Sandinista victory in Nicaragua, Morales. I extend that to other countries too, to Chile, Argentina, Ecuador, Uruguay, what was the atrocious fraud in Mexico. U.S. took that one away. It was worse than our Miami and our Ohio elections. What happened in Mexico was horrible. But the Americas have changed in 5 years. When we think back 25 years ago in Latin America, where U.S. militarism and imperialism had military dictatorships and fascist regimes all through the Americas, that is no longer the case. U.S. imperialism is crumbling in Latin America. What is your global view in other continents, in particular in Africa, with the influence of U.S. militarism, imperialism falling in Africa, in Asia? What has happened in our Americas? Where do you see that in other places in the world?
Okay, that's a big question. But I do think it is important to think globally. And I can say that South Africa is still a very important part of the world. It's an important part of the world for many reasons. Not only because of the eventually successful overturning of apartheid, but it's important because the people of South Africa decided to try to build a new world. And, we're the first to develop a constitution that included ideas that could never be expressed within the constitutional framework in this country, for example. the whole notion of building a non-racist society, the notion of building a non-sexist society, and the notion of building a non-homophobic society. I mean, these are campaigns that have been explicitly legitimized in the making of this new world in South Africa. Now, that being said, there are a lot of serious problems. And I don't know why it is we think that it's okay to sort of fall away, once the victory over the adversary is won. That, once apartheid is relegated to the dustbin of history, then everything's fine. And I always wonder, why we didn't keep our movements going? Why didn't we keep our South Africa solidarity movements going? Because now, more than ever before, people who are trying, for example, to counter the pattern of privatization need us. Even now, during this moment of very serious internal problems within the ANC, they need that solidarity. So, yeah, let me just say that. Things are very critical in a place like South Africa now. I might also talk about Rwanda and Somalia. Africa is really being, the continent of Africa is really being ravaged. And a lot of this has to do not with what they call the tribal, they like to talk about tribal violence and sectarian violence, but a lot of it has to do with the impact of global capitalism on the continent. And I think it's going to be important to formulate new kinds of what we used to call internationalism. Let me put it that way. Internationalist consciousness. And that would mean that we would learn not only how to, we would learn not only information about what's happening in other parts of the world, on other continents, that we would not only know what is going on there, but that we would have an emotional relationship as well. Because going back to what I said, I think at the very beginning of my talk, we somehow only think of Americans as real human beings. And this was revealed in the response to Katrina. Because people looked and they saw, all of those poor black people in New Orleans, and the only thing they could say was, this doesn't look like America. This looks like Africa. And it was said with, almost disdain. Like, how could this be happening here? This is not supposed to happen here. This is only supposed to happen in Africa. And as long as we have that kind of attitude, I think we're going to be in really bad shape. We have to learn some humility. We have to learn what solidarity means. Thank you for the question.
Hi, Ms. Davis, and I want to also welcome you to Oregon. I was hoping to have been able to get you up into Portland. However, that may be something we can work on, hopefully. Last I saw you was at the 40th reunion of the Panther Party and out in Oakland. It was a wonderful time that we had down there. I followed you for many years. I followed your suffering. I followed how you were persecuted. I've always admired you just for the strength, actually the strength between you and Kathleen Cleaver have really impacted my life. I think I mentioned to you when we were in Oakland that you were kind of responsible for me majoring in philosophy, and I'm going to put that, you know, to my demise, of course. However, that was something that you had said a few years back. One of the things that prompted me to study philosophy was how could a bright, beautiful, intelligent black woman embrace communism at a time when, as a sharecropper son from the South, you know, getting over the taboo sociologically of what communism was. Here, you were out being a proponent for it and making a great case for it. So I want to hearken back to this one point about it and something that you said once in Sacramento. And you made a statement similar to this, and it may not be paraphrased exactly correctly, but everything contains its own source or contains its own seed of destruction. At that time, you were talking about how capitalism had replaced feudalism and how capitalism itself was doomed because socialism was to replace capitalism as we moved on toward more perfect harmony of communism, supposedly. My question to you is today, do you still see on the horizon the end of capitalism or the end of the idea of private property or the private rights over the rights of the many? Is that still one of your charges, is still one of your issues of concern? Thank you very much.
Yeah. I mean, if I believed that we were doomed to live forever with capitalism, I don't know, what would I do? If I truly believe that, I don't think that I could continue to struggle in this way. And it's not only a question of belief. I mean, in a sense, that the point that you made, that you said I said. Well, you all also know that Marx said it. About the contradictions within capitalism also pointing toward another possibility, towards other possibilities. And I see that. I see that now more than ever before. And I think it is particularly important for us not to assume that the dismantling of what we used to call the socialist community of nations was, as a matter of fact, tantamount to the eternal victory of capitalism. Capitalism may have appeared to win, but it was only a victory by default. You know, it was because the kind of socialism that we saw in many places needed more. It needed to be engaged with critically. It needed a bit more democracy there. It needed a bit more here and there. But fundamentally, we should not forget the lesson that there were huge numbers of people in the world, not only in Cuba, for example. There were huge numbers of people in the world once who did not have to worry about how they were going to pay for their education. Huge numbers of people in the world who did not have to struggle to find money to pay rent. I mean, even those of us who are doing well, we pay an inordinate percentage of our wages and salaries just in order to live in the spaces that usually serve the purpose of creating some kind of space for us to rest long enough to recover so we can go back to work. So let's not forget that. Health care, where health care was not a commodity. And this is one of the reasons why I think it is so important to support Cuba, especially at this moment. especially now. Especially now. So yeah, no, I have definitely not given up on socialism. Definitely not given up on socialism.
I appreciate you coming out and seeing us, Ms. Davis. I'll try to keep my question fairly short and sweet. I was wondering, you've embraced freedom of speech to make your career, but at the same time embraced communism and obviously embraced the government of Cuba and the former Soviet Union. Does this seem like a mixed message when dealing with freedom of speech, since those countries are inherently suppressive of said speech?
Okay, I mean, that's actually a good question, and I welcome the opportunity to answer. And my answer would actually be very simple. I would argue that we have to think critically about those countries as well. I mean, when I speak or when I teach, I don't ever want people to accept what I'm saying simply because I'm saying. You know, what I try to do is to urge people to think in a different way, to think about something they may not have encountered or thought about before, but also learn how to ask questions about their own positions. So there are a lot of things I question about Cuba. And I actually preface the comment about countries like the former Soviet Union and the German Democratic Republic by saying that there were problems there and that those internal problems led to the demise of socialism and that those internal problems had to do with a lack of democracy. Not only a lack of political democracy, but a lack of economic democracy. And so I think the most important thing is to acquire what you might call habits of criticism. Habits of criticism. Not only in relation to things that you might be reading, but in relation to the words that you're using. And I welcome, and this happens to me, you know, when people, I always tell people, like, if you have anything you want to criticize me for, tell me, because it will help me. And sometimes people do, and I welcome that. Because I think we have to get into the habit of questioning that, particularly questioning that which we most take for granted. Because it seems to me that that is where the problems are. In that whole realm that we never, ever, ever question. The words that we use, the ways that we think about ourselves. This is why I was trying to actually point out some things that we normally don't take into consideration when we're trying to build movements. And finally, I guess is this the last question, or is there one more? Huh? How many more? Oh, what time are we supposed to be done? 5 or 10 minutes? We're over time already. One more question. One more question. No? Oh, okay, wait a second. I didn't realize you all were sitting there. So I tell you what, why don't the four of you get together and decide who gets to ask the question? No, you can. You stay here, because you were already there. I only saw you. And then why don't the three of you get together, and maybe one person could ask all of the questions in one. Okay.
My question is, how do you deal with burnout, and really what keeps you going?
Burnout. Well, you know, burnout actually is an ideological construction. When did this term first begin to be used? Does anyone know the history of burnout? Look it up. Where are you? Oh, no. Look it up. Because, this, of course we get tired. Everybody gets tired all the time. But what I was saying before was meant as a kind of remedy for what we have learned to call burnout. Because burnout is when we are so exhausted that we don't want to even think about what it is we're doing ever again. So my sense is that you have to love doing what you're doing. You have to be passionate about it, so passionate about it that you can't imagine yourself not doing it. And so it becomes a part of your life. And I always talk about when I was a child, my mother trying to explain to me what racism was all about. Saying, why I couldn't do this, why I couldn't go there. And she always used to say things are not supposed to be this way. And I remember that from the time I was 3 years old. She would say, this is not the way they are supposed to be. And one day, things will change. And so I kind of learned how, without having, any conceptual tools, I kind of learned what it meant to adopt a critical posture towards the world. And I think that's probably why I eventually started to do the work that I'm doing, both professionally in terms of the teaching that I do, but also in terms of the organizing that I do. And it's just something that is a part of me. It's like if I stopped doing it, I wouldn't be me. So, of course, I don't do it 24 hours a day. And I this I was telling, who was I telling? This morning I got up and I went to the fitness center at the hotel and I did my exercises and they had a nice jacuzzi. And so I took, But the point I'm making is that we also have to learn about the care of self. We have to be attentive to that as well. We can't work our bodies and our spirits so hard that we have nothing left. And so that would be my way of talking about how to avoid burnout. Do something that you really love. If you don't like being a member of the like the steering committee of an organization where you have to go to meeting after meeting after meeting, if that is like something that really turns you off, don't do that. You can find other ways to contribute. You can contribute. Look at what you're doing now and what you really love now. And try to figure out what talents you have, what skills you have that can be used in creating the foundation or building movements and do that and enjoy doing it. And don't do anything that you absolutely hate. Okay? And that's true with studying too. When your parents say, you should be a doctor and you hate biology, it doesn't make sense to do it. Do something that you can, because this is like for the long run, right? And you have to really learn how to inhabit yourself and be with yourself and enjoy yourself for a long time. Okay.
How can art directly affect policy change? Or is that possible?
Well, I think that art does a lot of work. Are you an artist? You're a dancer. Dance does a lot of work. Visual art does a lot of work. And I'm trying to be as succinct as possible. I would say in the most general sense, art, whether it's popular art or what they call high art, for me, it does the best kind of work when it makes us feel like we're capable of creating something else. I'm talking about those of us who are not necessarily artists, but those of us who witness it, who encounter it, and oftentimes art can affect people so much more deeply than political speech. I mean, if you think about this, I'm all tangled up here. If you think about this wonderful afternoon we've had together, that's good and that's great. But you know, you'll forget about it. I mean, it just kind of fades away after a while. And, or maybe we've also produced some art here. But what I would say is that art, I actually like to use the word that Theodore Adorno used in his theory of aesthetics. And he talks about the shudder. That, you know, sometimes you encounter something that makes you feel for a moment that everything could be different, and it's like a shudder that goes through your spirit and your body. And I mean, I like to think that we can use those moments and carry them with us. And so therefore, when I judge what is good art and bad art, I mean, there are all kinds of, when I judge what's good art and bad art, I say good art is the art that I take with me, that I remember, that haunts me, that will not let me go. So, you know, those movies that I go to see, and once the lights come on, you never think about them again. That's like one thing. And you can have fun, you can laugh and whatever, but, or if they usually if they solve all the problems for you, which Hollywood likes to do, then you don't have to do any work. You don't have to think about it, so it's not. So I like those things that stay with me, that demand attention from me, that demand me to be active and to think in a different way. And I think art can do that. Not necessarily because that's what you try to do, but just because you're trying to produce something beautiful and powerful and something different and something that in a sense metaphorically says that if I can create this work of art, this world, if it's a world that lasts for 10 minutes during a dance, or if it's a world that you see framed around a piece of, around a painting or a photograph or whatever. But if that is possible, then it's possible for us to exert our creativity in different ways. Perhaps it's possible for us to create a different social world. So this is why I think art is so important. And when I talk about the extent to which popular culture has become the venue for the politicalization of youth, I take that very seriously because those forms of popular culture have so much promise, so much potential, despite the fact that, you know, many people are always criticizing, say, hip-hop music because they say it's misogynist, and, you know, what isn't? But I think there are these ways of revisioning the world that we do not get from anywhere else. So thank you for the question.
We have a two-part question that arises out of Black History Month and the celebration of Dr. Martin Luther King's birthday. The first is something that came up in our own community this past week and touches upon your issues about solidarity. which is when you have civil rights leaders who express homophobic and anti-gay sentiments, how do we as a community both honor their contributions to the civil rights movement and hold them accountable and call them on their homophobia without being attacked by the very community they're speaking within?
Well, that's a great question, but I think you're also answering it because you can't not call them. And it's not as if those civil rights leaders, those black ministers, those daughters of black history legacies, I'm talking about Dr. King's daughter, represent the whole story. So when you criticize, for example, Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, who, I don't know, some of you may know his name, probably most of you don't. I know him because he was the leading civil rights figure in Birmingham, Alabama, during that period I talked about earlier. I went to school with his children. His children were arrested, and his house was bombed I don't know how many times. I mean, he came under continuous attack by the Ku Klux Klan, by the Bull Connor and the police, and his children were attacked. And like I said, they were followed, and his house was bombed, as I said, and it was bombed again, and it was burned. And I mean, it was horrible, and he was the most identifiable figure in the civil rights movement in Birmingham. And also, most recently, during the debate around gay marriage, Reverend Shuttlesworth said, some of the most horrendous things. And that's the way it is. I mean, you can't try to solve or resolve that contradiction, because that's just what happened. And no movement can live only on its past laurels. And also, this is something that I think black communities have to learn, that being in the forefront of progressive social justice movements at one moment in history is not a guarantee that those communities will always be there. Especially not if they are not willing to understand new developments, new ideas, new forms of racisms, new articulations of racisms with sexisms and homophobia. And in relation to the dilemma regarding the civil rights movement, all you have to do is say, well, I stand with Coretta Scott King. That's all you have to say. Because Coretta Scott King worked tirelessly against homophobia. She was publicly outspoken. She participated in a lot of events that were organized by groups in the LBTG community. And I have dyslexia, you have to excuse me. So I get numbers and letters confused all the time. And that's basically all you have to do. And then I should say, I spoke earlier in Corvallis. That was yesterday, I think. Feels like it was earlier. And someone asked me a question. A young black gay man asked me a question regarding how to begin to bring communities together. And I was actually talking to him a little bit about Louisville Kentucky. Any of you ever been to Louisville? Okay, Louisville, okay. Louisville's an amazing place, and nobody ever thinks about it, except when the Kentucky Derby happens, right? But over the years in Louisville, there has been this strong alliance created between black community activists, black ministers especially, and the gay movement in Louisville. And it was, you remember when there were all of these efforts to develop local legislation that called for non-discrimination against gays, lesbians, bisexuals, transgender, etc. So it was during that period that a campaign called the Fairness Campaign developed. And at first it was specifically around anti-gay discrimination. And then it was broadened to include racist and classist-based discrimination. And eventually, this amazing alliance was created in the city, which is still quite active now. And as a matter of fact, when I was last there, it was for the inauguration of a chair at the University of Louisville, which was developed based on community activism. I'm talking about an endowed chair, right? I mean, you know what that means. Do you know how chairs get endowed? Okay, somebody has to give money, and usually not less than $1 million, because the chair has to produce the salary of whoever holds it by the interest. So there has to be enough money that the principal can remain. And so there was this community effort to create a chair at the university. And the name of this chair, people decided, would be the Audre Lorde Chair for the study of race, class, gender, and sexuality. Now that chair exists right now. It's a chair that is jointly held by the Women's Studies Department and the Pan-African Studies Department. And I went for the inauguration of that chair, and it was, and actually I said this last night in Corvallis, it was really quite pleasing to hear the president of the university. I don't know whether he's still the president. This was maybe 2 years ago. He probably still is. But I heard he was a friend of George Bush's or somebody like that. But anyway, kind of on the conservative side, you know what I mean? So, and it just felt so good to have him acknowledge that because this $1 million had been raised by the community, the university was going to have to match it with another $1 million. And so he had to say something like, I mean, this is a man who probably never said sexuality studies in his entire life. So he had to get up there and say that we hereby inaugurate the Audre Lorde Chair for the study of race, class, gender, and sexuality. So it's possible. Things like that are possible. So now that we are inspired, we have to figure out what we are going to do. So each one of us should ask ourselves that question. Thank you very much.